Here to weigh in on the life and legacy of Ed Broadbent is Brian Topp, Chair of the Board of the Broadbent Institute. And in studio with me is Anne McGrath, the National Director of Canada's New Democratic Party. I want to thank you both for joining me. I'm sure it's a difficult day and some happy memories there, I think, but a sad day for you and New Democrats.
Yeah, it's very sad. It's a huge loss. Brian and I both knew Ed very well and worked with him quite a bit over the years. And you know, he made a massive contribution to the NDP, but also a massive contribution to social democracy internationally, and a huge contribution to Canada. I mean, you know, he was a champion for human rights, for an end to income inequality, for women's rights, for Indigenous rights. He was, you know, he founded the Broadbent Institute, which has done fantastic work on advancing all of those principles, and most recently wrote a book. I mean, I don't know if I'm going to be doing that at 88, but that's an amazing thing to me. And I saw him not that long ago. Brian was there, and you know, he was sharp, he was smart, he was concerned about, you know, he always wanted to know what was going on and always had his opinions on it. And I benefited greatly from his friendship and his leadership.
Brian Topp, he sort of had an unusual, if you look at it, it's an unusual political career. A former university professor who wins a seat in Parliament by beating a federal Conservative cabinet minister by just 15 votes, and then goes on to lead a party for nearly 15 years.
Yeah, he was landside Ed there in the first outing, but you know, he was a very, very good senior political figure, and that background as academic served him very well. At one level, he was a very practical politician, and he was aiming to win. And that's what I got to say, one of the things that I principally admired about Ed as a political leader was that he was aiming to win. He really wanted to be in government to do the stuff he believed in. And he combined that with being a committed idealist and a highly principled person. And by the way, a really nice guy. And so he was certainly one for the ages, a role model, I would say, in our politics at a time of angry populism. Ed's the opposite. Ed was what you do when you don't want to be governed by angry populists.
And he sort of fits into that New Democrat pantheon of Tommy Douglas, Jack Layton, and Ed Broadbent. Those would be the three titans of your party and your movement when I look at it. I mean, what do you think Ed Broadbent's legacy is today? I mean, as Brian points out, he had a very different approach than what we see in a lot of political conversations today. Yeah,
there's no question that we've had some incredible leaders in our movement, and he stands there for sure with them. What I found very remarkable about him was how incredibly generous he was. So, you know, a lot of times in our movement, certainly in our party, there are a lot of young people who come in who are really committed and really want to do things and really look up to these people like Ed Broadbent, and he always had time for them. He was very, very generous with his opinions, with his time, with his experience. And you know, I've traveled across the country, and everywhere I have gone across the country, people want to tell me stories about Ed Broadbent and about Jack Layton. I mean, they are, you know, they are very, very symbolic of the things that the NDP stands for, you know, and I think, you know, Brian is absolutely right. It's, you know, often people have talked about the NDP as the conscience of Parliament, and he was very much of the view that we should not be there to be the conscience of Parliament, that we should be aiming to get elected and to win so that we can do things to help people.
Brian, it looked for a while that might happen. I mentioned this to Brian Mulroney in our conversation. In 1987, Ed Broadbent was number one, right? The NDP had a 14-point lead over the Conservatives in the run-up to what would be the decisive free trade election of 1988. What do you think it was about Ed Broadbent in particular that made the New Democrats so competitive and actually got them to first place in public opinion polls for a period of time?
Well, I remember that campaign very well. It was the first campaign I did working with Ed as a distant, one of those young people Dan was just talking about. And look, at its root, what Ed was up to, basically between 84 and 88, was he had the insight that there's no victory for the NDP that doesn't go through Quebec. And so he had a big focus on the province of Quebec, and they really liked him. And as he went up and up in the province of Quebec, the rest of the country followed, because when his polling numbers started coming up, courtesy of the support he was earning in French Canada, then people in English Canada gave him a look too. And so he had found a strategy that was going to work for his party. He was, and as you say, in 1987, first of all, there were some great polls and some serious articles saying he's got a shot at winning. What defeated him was the guy you just had on, Brian Mulroney, who was also quite good at his craft, who figured out how to reframe the election onto issues that were less good for Ed in the province of Quebec. But he never forgot that strategy. And it is important to remember that Ed came back after having retired and came back to Parliament to help Jack Layton get launched as leader. And the strategy that Ed was pursuing that got him to where you're talking about, he commended to Jack. And Jack followed it on the insight that there's no victory for the NDP that doesn't go through Quebec. And when he got that breakthrough in Quebec, he was one step away from being Prime Minister. And so, this speaks to what I think is fascinating about Ed Broadbent, that he's a super nice guy, yes, a principled person, yes, and a very hard-headed, practical politician who was aiming to win. And that was a combination that he handed on to Layton. And as we can see, it's the NDP's road to victory.
Brian, just to stick with you for a second, you said you were one of the young people that Anne referenced that Ed Broadbent always had time for. I'm not saying you're old, but when you were older, he also had time for you in the 2011 leadership race. He endorsed you. He backed you. I know that didn't go the way you were hoping, but that must have felt pretty good. What did it feel like when Ed Broadbent said, this is the guy to lead this party?
Yeah, it was a fantastic honor. It really was. And you're right that I didn't quite get there, c'est la vie. But that was where we moved from, him being the boss that I worked for to us starting to become friends. And so in that sense, I was still the winner because I picked up a fabulous friend. And, as Anne says, he was sharp right to the end. I had dinner with him just before Christmas. And it may surprise Anne to hear that there was a bottle of wine there. And we solved all the world's problems once again. And, he was sharp to the end, and he's also followed Canadian politics very closely. I worked in the Manitoba campaign where Wab Kinew was just elected. He was one of the first to call, asking how it was shaping up. And he was one of the first to call after we had the election result. And he was, fascinated by the details of aiming to win, as he was by the principles that were at play. And if you let me just add one more thing, you can see that at play, for example, in what Anne was talking about earlier, in the very big fingerprints that he has on the Canadian Charter of Rights. The language in there on equality for women, support for First Nations treaty rights, and the acknowledgement of the Western Canada owns its own resources. There were many people working on those files, but he was a key one. And in that sense, there's a very big Ed Broadbent legacy that's going to last in this country for a very long time.
And on the legacy question, how do you think Ed Broadbent would want to be remembered? Because everyone's going to remember him in their own way. How do you think he would want people to view his contribution?
Well, I think, he was a champion for human rights, and I think he would want people to recognize, number one, that he was a social democrat, that he was a new Democrat through and through, that he always supported the party and felt like the party should form government. I mean, he wanted the NDP to form government before he left planet Earth, and he said that. But also that he always came through when I often refer to it as we would put out the bat signal and he always showed up and did whatever was asked of him. Like when he came back in 2004 and agreed to run in Ottawa Centre, that was huge. And he sat in that caucus. I was there then. He sat in that caucus as a former leader who was there to support the current leader. That's not something that everybody can do.
No.
He was in a caucus with peers supporting a leader that wasn't him, even though he had previously been a leader. So he was just really, really sure of his role, sure of his positions, but always ready to work collectively to get things done.
But what you touched on there, so much of his career is unusual in a way. To be a leader of a party for 14 and a half years, to get the shot to run in 4 national elections, that's unimaginable in modern or contemporary politics. That was modern, but in contemporary politics, that's unimaginable. Something like that would happen.
Yeah, totally. And he was, like I said, he was just so generous and so compassionate and so smart. Like, the guy was sharp as a whip. He was like, he had a giant intellect, and yet at the same time was able to talk to people in ways that didn't just kind of show off his intellectual prowess, but actually got to what people were concerned about and what the solutions could be.
But Brian, it's interesting when you look back at some of his core principles and compare them to sort of where consensus opinion is now, opposing free trade, which is something I guess most Canadians now would broadly support, the idea of pulling out of NATO, very different positions in a very different time than what we're in now in 2024.
Yep, that's right. He was a man of his era. And you'll notice that he wasn't talking about that stuff currently.
No.
But his core underlying principles never changed from when he was an academic. He was passionately committed to equality and talked about it his whole career, and not just in principle, but in outcome. And so he stuck to his principles as a social democrat for sure. And but he, we're talking about the two sides of the man here. That one level, he's a highly principled individual, but also a very practical politician who wanted to win. And that means that he evolved with his times, which is what you need to do when you want to win, particularly when you want the kind of long run that you were just talking about, which, as you say, is highly unusual. And if you want a long run like that, then you need to respond to new facts.
Yes, you have to evolve if you're going to last in politics, or be completely strident and just get elected by a very narrow coalition. But, Brian Topp, I guess the same question I put to Anne. How do you think Ed Broadbent will want people to remember him and assess his legacy and view his contribution to Canadian politics and public life?
I think what he will want to be remembered by is, first of all, what I just talked about, that equality should be at the center of our politics and that we should not be satisfied with the way things are now. He was not satisfied with the way things are now. He wanted to change them. And secondly, that there's a route to getting that change without resorting to angry populism through elective politics and through parliaments. And so he was a deeply committed Democrat, as you've been saying in reviewing his career. He spent a big chunk of time talking about democracy, and that was because he was passionate about it. And so he believed that you could do big things through democratic elections. And I think that's what we should all retain. And when we said earlier today, what he would really want us to do is carry on his work, that's the work that he would want carried on.
And you mentioned that whenever you fired up the bat signal, he would respond. And that was the case in 2008 when him and Jean Chrétien sort of came together to help orchestrate this attempted coalition between the NDP, the Liberals, and the Bloc. What was it about him that, look, he said that didn't go too well. And it was probably the wrong approach, and I think that's kind of the way it was borne out. But what was it about Ed Broadbent that made you want him for something this delicate and this potentially controversial?
Well, for one thing, he was a very skilled negotiator. He saw the goal, and he knew how to get there. He had great relationships across different parties, as we're seeing today, but we've seen all along. And he was very. He wasn't rigid in his politics.
Right.
He knew how to maneuver, and so and plus he had that kind of historic. Significance in the party that was very, very important. And like Brian and I were both there during that, and he was all of those things, but also a lot of fun. Like, there were some very, very fun moments during that, and he was very fun, and he was very, very funny. And but we asked him to show up. He showed up. It was freezing cold, you might remember, and we kind of buckled down and just did the work. And he was not a young man at that time either, and he just kind of he did the hard. He didn't just do the kind of standing in front of cameras kind of stuff. He did the hard work in the back room, making sure that it was something that we could do, that we could actually get done.
If I could just add to that, it's also worth remembering that Ed joined that steering committee in partnership with Alan Blakeney.
Yes.
And there's two things about that I think are interesting to bring out. And the first is that the key thing, in my view, that they both contributed was that they were universally trusted in the party.
Right.
And so at a time when the DRAC was trying to do something really big, which was to kick a minority Tory government out of office and to have the majority that was in Parliament govern, that the party trusted them. Trusted, what many argue was the best NDP premier that we ever had, and one of the best federal leaders that we ever had. So he was enormously trusted. Another piece of the puzzle was that during the constitutional battles, Ed Broadbent and Alan Blakeney had some big fights, some really big fights on the details of, particularly of the resource clauses. And, frankly, in hindsight, it's a little hard sometimes to figure out what they were fighting about, but they did. And so, as a footnote, those two worked very amicably together on that project, and they were a most formidable people to report to as we were working through that. And they kind of rekindled their own friendship that had gone through a bit of a hard pass during the constitutional wars.
No, you make a good point there about being trusted, and in that case, it wouldn't just be within your own party, but by the other parties. And that's something that Brian Mulroney even said in the interview with me earlier, that he's a man of dignity and a man of honesty. I want to thank you both for joining me and speaking about your friend Brian Topp and Anne McGrath. I'm sorry for your loss, but I'm grateful for your time. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has tweeted out his condolences following the passing of Ed Broadbent. Trudeau said Canada is better off because of Ed Broadbent's selfless service, an advocate for equality and champion for justice. His commitment to helping others never wavered. He leaves behind an incredible legacy, one that will no doubt continue to inspire people across the country. To the Broadbent family, to his friends, and to all of the Canadians who are mourning the passing of this visionary leader, I'm keeping you in my thoughts, and I'm sending you my deepest condolences. NDP leader Jagmeet Singh called Ed Broadbent a mentor and a friend. Singh says Broadbent was a lifelong champion of our movement and our party, and that he was always generous with his time. Jagmeet Singh joins us now from Kingston. Mr. Singh, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Your statement touched on Ed Broadbent's generosity with his time. We've heard the same thing from Anne McGrath, from Brian Topp. How was Ed Broadbent generous to you as a leader of the Democratic Party?
Well, he was someone I called right when I became leader. I asked him for advice, and since that first call when I asked him for advice, he never said no to me. I asked him for so many different things. He campaigned with me in 2019. We walked the Lansdowne Farmers Market in Ottawa together. We spent lots of time together chatting about the future of the party and decisions. I asked for his advice on the agreement, and he was there for me and encouraged me. We were just together a couple months ago at the Progress Institute that he started, the Broadbent Institute dinner in Toronto. There's a picture circulating of us all together when we listened to President Biden in Parliament, where my wife, my daughter, and Ed were all together. We've had lots of really special moments, but most importantly, he was very actively a mentor to me, helping me through getting my feet on the ground as a new leader and navigating federal politics, and just always there for me. He would always answer my call, and not just answer my call, but answer whatever help I needed. If I needed to meet up, if I needed him to come in and meet with my team, he always said yes.
You say you reached out to him for advice when you first became leader. What's the best piece of advice he gave you about the role that you were taking on?
Well, one of the things he said to me, and he repeated this many times when we would chat, was that sometimes New Democrats have this debate. Can we stay consistent with our values, or should we try to focus on winning? And he made it really clear that we need to do both, that it's not an either or, it's a both. We need to be consistent with our values, and we need to be in a position to make life better for working people. And that was something that he really emphasized, and it was a big part of his legacy. He contributed to the movement to say he wasn't trying to be the conscience of Parliament. He wanted to be the next Prime Minister. And that was a vision that I really took to heart. And then when we were able to bring in something like the National Dental Care Program, he said this is exactly why we're New Democrats, to force government to bring in things so we can bring them in ourselves, but to force the change, not to just raise concerns, but to bring in material changes to people's lives, like ensuring that people can get their teeth looked after, saving the money, and improving their health. This is why we became New Democrats. So he was really encouraging and supportive, but also really pushed this idea that we need to fight to be in a position to make life better for people.
You said that you reached out to him to discuss the supply and confidence agreement that you have with the federal Liberals right now that is expected to run until the election in 2025. He was a little bit critical of it, though, in one of the last interviews he did with Rosemary Barton, saying he felt it was for too long. It went on for too long and maybe limited a bit of your leverage. Did he ever speak about that with you, when you were considering this or when you were seeking his advice on that? What did he advise you on this agreement?
We actually chatted right after that interview, and he made it really clear. He said, listen, I want you to know, I believe in everything you're doing. My major concern is, how do we make these liberals do what they say they're going to do? And two, how do you get the credit? And I chuckled because that is something that Ed always kept in his mind. He didn't just want us to be able to make a difference for people now. He also wanted us to be elected in the future to continue to make a difference in people's lives. So he was really concerned about how we could get that credit. And he knew that liberals would backtrack on things. So he wanted to make sure that we had ways to force them to deliver. So I appreciate that advice. But like I said, he was very proud that we were able to use our power to make some big changes in people's lives. And he made that really clear to me.
I wonder, Mr. Singh, how would you assess Ed Broadbent's legacy? Not just for the New Democratic Party. He's clearly in that Jack Layton, Ed Broadbent, Tommy Douglas sort of stratosphere for the New Democrats, but for Canadian politics and for the country at large.
Well, I would put it to you this way. Whenever we would be at events, I would always find him in the crowd if I knew he was there and say, folks, Ed Broadbent is in the crowd today, and he's who I want to be when I grow up. And I said that, and every time I said it, Ed would laugh as if it was the first time I said that joke. He was very generous with his humor as well as with his time. And the reason why I said that is, the reason why he is so special is that he never stopped fighting. He was an elected official. He was a leader of a party. Then another leader, Jack Layton, asked him to run again, and he did it. And then when he retired from political life, he didn't stop giving back. He founded a progressive institute, which is now a powerful voice for working people again. And that is a part of who he is. His legacy is he never stopped. He never stopped fighting for people. Even while retired, even having started an institute, he was a big mentor to me as the 8th leader of the New Democratic Party. So he never stopped caring about people, about the movement. And that's a big part of why he is someone that I'll always remember. I am sad today that he has passed, but I am so honored to have known him and to have had the privilege of receiving his guidance and wisdom, and someone that I can look up to as how one should live their life, to constantly and always find a way to give back to build a better future.
Federal NDP leader Jagmeet Singh, thank you so much for joining us today. We appreciate the time, sir.
Thank you.
Well, longtime New Democrat Party leader Ed Broadbent has died. He was 87 years old. Bob Rae, Canada's ambassador to the UN, previously served as an NDP MP. There's a young Bob Rae there, from 1978 to 1982, when Ed Broadbent was the leader of the federal NDP. And Bob Rae joins me now in the studio. I saw you giggling and smiling when you saw a picture.
Well, looking, I have that picture. I'm going to put it up today on my account, but and it brings back a lot of memories. Ed I've supported Ed at the convention in 1975 when I was a law student, and ran for him when 1978 in Broadview, and then was reelected many times. It's for me, it's a moment that brings back many memories of a really wonderful guy. He was unusually. I mean, I guess he was unusually thoughtful. He was a very intelligent guy. He started out as a political science professor at York University when he was first elected, but he never left who he was, where he came from, what he really believed in. He was a very committed social democrat or democratic socialist. I mean, people argue about the terms. He believed in solidarity intensely. But the thing that he believed in more than anything else in his whole life was decency. He wanted people to be treated decently. He was a decent guy. He treated people fairly. I worked with him as a colleague. He was my leader. He was my mentor in many ways. I mean, we went through a lot of discussions around the decisions that I had to make in becoming premier. And when I decided to leave the federal caucus in 1982, it was a tough moment for me, and I think for him too. He was a remarkable man, and when I think of him, I think of the era that we went through at that time, which is, if I may say so, quite different from the era that we're in at the moment. So it's a sad moment for me. I was shocked when I got the news.
What was it? You spent about 4 years in his caucus when he was leader, and then you were, of course, the provincial leader, and there was an overlap there between your careers. What was he like as a leader? What was it like to be in his caucus?
Well, first of all, the caucus was very rambunctious. We had a young caucus. I know that people who are watching this now will say, "Who is this guy talking about? You know, how could he have been part of a young anything?" But we had a whole bunch of people who were in their late 20s and early 30s who were newly elected, and it was a transition period. And Ed was the successor to David Lewis and Tommy Douglas, and the Wordsworth and that whole tradition. And Ed, I think, was taken aback by people like Jim Fulton and Bill Blakey and me and others who were very forthright and engaged. But the thing is, we went through a hell of a time because we went through the whole period of constitutional change. We went through the minority government of Mr. Clark, which eventually was defeated. Right. And then we went through the repatriation of the Constitution, where we played the NDP played a critical role. And Ed was a wonderful leader. He was collegial. He was consultative. He listened a lot, and he tried to forge consensus, even though it was not always possible or always easy. And he was extremely fair-minded. He didn't like disciplining people, right? And it's hard to do as a party leader anyway.
We just talked to Jagmeet Singh about the supply and confidence agreement that he has with Justin Trudeau's Liberals.
Yes.
I think it was 1980 when Pierre Elliott Trudeau approached Ed Broadbent about a coalition government.
Yes.
And he turned it down.
Flat.
I mean,
without actually talking to anybody.
Oh, okay. I was going to say, were you asked about that? Did you know anything? Was it the right choice?
No, he just came in and said I've decided not to. And because he'd thought it through, he said, he asked me on the spot. I said, no, I don't think that's going to work, because these things only work with the power of numbers. If you have leverage, then you're in a position. But the Liberals had a majority. And I think Mr. Trudeau wanted us in because he wanted Western representation.
Yes, because Saskatchewan and BC seats at the time.
To deal with the challenge that he was facing, that he knew he'd be facing on the Constitution. No, actually, it's funny. I said he was consulted. That's one thing he didn't consult us on. And there were some people who said we should at least have talked about it. But no, seriously. I mean, Ed was just an extremely decent guy, incredibly hardworking. I think I heard Jagmeet saying the way he came back, continued to come back, and for him politics was a vocation for him. Public service was a vocation for him, and I think it's important for Canadians to know, and young Canadians to know, that there are people who just believe that this is what you do. You give back, and you contribute. And he believed in the public good. He believed intensely in fairness for working families, and he believed intensely that Canada could be a fairer and better country than it was, and even than it is. And he never changed tunes. Thinking of myself, because he was very critical of my decision to leave the New Democrats for the Liberals. He never changed parties. But his friendship was consistent, and he was.
Did he give you a lot of grief over that? Did he give you a lot of?
No. We wrote one strong article where he rejected what I did, and I saw him a few days later, not long after, and he looked at me and he said, "Are we still talking?" I said, "Absolutely, we're still talking. Why wouldn't I talk to you?" And we continued to talk after. And when I went to work on Indigenous issues, he was extremely supportive. And when I was appointed to the UN, he was one of the first people to call me up and say, "That's a great place for you to be." So I've managed to, our personal relationship managed to survive the political divorce.
Just as a final point, like his decency that you talk about, I'm dating myself a bit here too. I remember the first real national election I paid attention to was 1988. I was 15, free trade, all of these things were happening. And I'm looking at this old New York Times article from November 8th, 1987, a leftist leader surging in Canada. I talked to Brian Mulroney about this earlier in the show. Ed Broadbent was first in the polls, according to a Globe and Mail poll then, 38% for him, 35% for the Liberals, 24% for the Mulroney Conservatives, who ended up having the big win. He almost got there. It was right there. That sort of decency and clarity you speak of. almost carried him to the big job.
Well, you know, one of the regrets that I have is in some ways I think Ed left too soon. I believe that, I mean, he left elected politics. He went on to head up the Democratic Institute that Mr. Mulrooney actually appointed him to. But nobody was more disappointed than I was. I was leader of the NDP in Ontario at the time, and I was at the announcement where he announced that he was stepping down. And I can remember saying too loudly, because I thought I was just whispering, but as often is the case, I was talking a little louder than that. And I just said, no, 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 no. And I felt very strongly that he was very disappointed in the election result, the free trade election. But we got caught in a squeeze. The NDP got caught in a squeeze that he couldn't get out of. And I still believe that you know, it was still there. I mean, he needed to, but he didn't want it. He'd been there since '68. He'd been there for 20 years of service. But he kept on giving back in many other ways. He had a great sense of humor. He was, above all, he was. I went through some very difficult personal times in the '80s with my wife's parents and my own brother, and he could not have been kinder. And I think that's a quality in politics that's often undervalued. Is, you know, kindness is everything and curiosity is everything, as the late John Godfrey said. And I think Ed had both things. He was curious and he was constantly interested in what was going on. And he was an extremely kind and decent guy. And I think everybody who knew him and worked with him will remember him that way.
No, certainly in all the conversations we've had about it since the news broke, decency and dignity are two things that come through. Bob Ray, I want to thank you for coming in.
Thanks,
David.
David. Thank you. Good to talk to you.
It's UN Ambassador Bob Ray.